Section 4. The Story of Atlantis by William Scott-Elliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Atlantis, Part 4. Emigrations. Three causes contributed to produce emigrations. The Turanian race, as we have seen, was from its very start imbued with the spirit of colonizing, which it carried out on a considerable scale. The Semites and Akkadians were also to a certain extent colonizing races. Then, as time went on and population tended more and more to outrun the limits of subsistence, necessity operated with the least well-to-do in every race alike, and drove them to seek for a livelihood in less thickly populated countries. For it should be realized that when the Atlanteans reached their zenith in the Toltec era, the proportion of population to the square mile on the continent of Atlantis probably equalled, even if it did not exceed, our modern experience in England and Belgium. It is at all events certain that the vacant spaces available for colonizing were very much larger in that age than in ours, while the total population of the world, which at the present moment is probably not more than 1,200 to 1,500 millions, amounted in those days to the big figure of about 2,000 millions. Lastly, there were the priest-led emigrations, which took place prior to each catastrophe, and there were many more of these than the four great ones referred to above. The initiated kings and priests who followed the good law were aware beforehand of the impending calamities. Each one therefore naturally became a centre of prophetic warning, and ultimately a leader of a band of colonists. It may be noted here that in later days the rulers of the country deeply resented these priest-led emigrations, as tending to impoverish and depopulate their kingdoms, and it became necessary for the emigrants to get on board ship secretly during the night. In roughly tracing the lines of emigration followed by each sub-race in turn, we shall of necessity ultimately reach the lands which their respective descendants today occupy. For the earliest emigrations we must go back to the Rmoahal days. It will be remembered that that portion of the race which inhabited the northeastern coasts alone retained its purity of blood. Harried on their southern borders and driven further north by the Tlavatli warriors, they began to overflow to the neighbouring land, to the east, and to the still nearer promontory of Greenland. In the second map period no pure Rmoahals were left on the then reduced mother continent, but the northern promontory of the continent, then rising on the west, was occupied by them, as well as the Greenland Cape already mentioned, and the western shores of the great Scandinavian island. There was also a colony on the land lying north of the Central Asian Sea. Brittany and Picardy then formed part of the Scandinavian island, while the island itself became, in the third map period, part of the growing continent of Europe. Now it is in France that the remains of this race have been found in the Quaternary strata, and the brachycephalus, or round-headed specimen known as the fur-footed man, may be taken as a fair average of the type of the race in its decay. Many times forced to move south by the rigours of a glacial epoch, many times driven north by the greed of their more powerful neighbours, the scattered and degraded remnants of this race may be found today in the modern Lapps, though even here there was some infusion of other blood. And so it comes to pass that these faded and stunted specimens of humanity are the lineal descendants of the black race of giants who arose on the equatorial lands of Lemuria well nigh 5 million years ago. The Tlavatli colonists seem to have spread out toward every point of the compass. By the second map period, their descendants were settled on the western shores of the then growing American continent, California, as well as on its extreme southern coast, Rio de Janeiro. We also find them occupying the eastern shores of the Scandinavian island, while numbers of them sailed across the ocean, rounded the coast of Africa, and reached India. There, mixing with the indigenous Lemurian population, they formed the Dravidian race. In later days this in its turn received an infusion of Aryan or fifth race blood, from which results the complexity of type found in India today. In fact, we have here a very fair example of the extreme difficulty of deciding any question of race upon merely physical evidence, for it would be quite possible to have fifth race egos incarnate among the Brahmans, fourth race egos among the lower castes, and some lingering third race among the hill tribes. By the fourth map period we find the Tlavatli people occupying the southern parts of South America, from which it may be inferred that the Patagonians probably had remote Tlavatli ancestry. Remains of this race, as of the Rmoahals, have been found in the Quaternary strata of Central Europe, and the dolichocephalous Cro-Magnon man may be taken as an average specimen of the race in its decadence, while the lake dwellers of Switzerland formed an even earlier and not quite pure offshoot. The only people who can be cited as fairly pure-blooded specimens of the race at the present day are some of the brown tribes of Indians of South America. The Burmese and Siamese have also Tlavatli blood in their veins, but in their case it was mixed with and therefore dominated by the nobler stock of one of the Aryan sub-races. We now come to the Toltecs. It was chiefly to the west that their emigrations tended, and the neighbouring coasts of the American continent were in the second map period peopled by a pure Toltec race, the greater part of those left on the mother continent being then of very mixed blood. It was on the continents of North and South America that this race spread abroad and flourished, and on which thousands of years later were established the empires of Mexico and Peru. The greatness of these empires is a matter of history, or at least of tradition supplemented by such evidence as is afforded by magnificent architectural remains. It may here be noted that while the Mexican Empire was for centuries great and powerful in all that is usually regarded as power and greatness in our civilization of today, it never reached the height attained by the Peruvians about 14,000 years ago under their Inca sovereigns. For, as regards the general well-being of the people, the justice and beneficence of the government, the equitable nature of the land tenure, and the pure and religious life of the inhabitants, the Peruvian Empire of those days might be considered a traditional though faint echo of the golden age of the Toltecs on the mother continent of Atlantis. The average Red Indian of North or South America is the best representative today of the Toltec people, but of course bears no comparison with the highly civilized individual of the race at its zenith. Egypt must now be referred to, and the consideration of this subject should let in a flood of light upon its early history. Although the first settlement in that country was not in the strict sense of the term a colony, it was from the Toltec race that was subsequently drawn the first great body of emigrants intended to mix with and dominate the aboriginal people. In the first instance it was the transfer of a great lodge of initiates. This took place about 400,000 years ago. The golden age of the Toltecs was long past. The first great catastrophe had taken place. The moral degradation of the people and the consequent practice of the black arts were becoming more accentuated and widely spread. Purer surroundings for the White Lodge were needed. Egypt was isolated and was thinly peopled, and therefore Egypt was chosen. The settlement so made answered its purpose, and undisturbed by adverse conditions, the Lodge of Initiates for nearly 200,000 years did its work. About 210,000 years ago, when the time was ripe, the Occult Lodge founded an empire, the first divine dynasty of Egypt, and began to teach the people. Then it was that the first great body of colonists was brought from Atlantis, and some time during the 10,000 years that led up to the second catastrophe, the two great pyramids of Giza were built, partly to provide permanent halls of initiation, but also to act as treasure house and shrine for some great talisman of power during the submergence which the initiates knew to be impending. Map number 3 shows Egypt at that date as under water. It remained so for a considerable period, but on its re-emergence it was again peopled by the descendants of many of its old inhabitants who had retired to the Abyssinian mountains, shown in map number 3 as an island, as well as by fresh bands of Atlantean colonists from various parts of the world. A considerable immigration of Akkadians then helped to modify the Egyptian type. This is the era of the second divine dynasty of Egypt, the rulers of the country being again initiated adepts. The catastrophe of 80,000 years ago again laid the country under water, but this time it was only a temporary wave. When it receded, the third divine dynasty, that mentioned by Manetho, began its rule, and it was under the early kings of this dynasty that the great temple of Karnak and many of the more ancient buildings still standing in Egypt were constructed. In fact, with the exception of the 2 pyramids, no building in Egypt predates the catastrophe of 80,000 years ago. The final submergence of Poseidonis sent another tidal wave over Egypt. This, too, was only a temporary calamity, but it brought the divine dynasties to an end, for the Lodge of Initiates had transferred its quarters to other lands. Various points here left untouched have already been dealt with in the transaction of the London Lodge, the Pyramids and Stonehenge. The Turanians, who in the first map period had colonized the northern parts of the land, lying immediately to the east of Atlantis, occupied in the second map period its southern shores, which included the present Morocco and Algeria. We also find them wandering eastwards, and both the east and west coasts of the Central Asia Sea were peopled by them. Bands of them ultimately moved still further east, and the nearest approximation to the type of this race is today to be found in the inland Chinese. A curious freak of destiny must be recorded about one of their western offshoots. Dominated all through the centuries by their more powerful Toltec neighbours, it was yet reserved for a small branch of the Turanian stock to conquer and replace the last great empire that the Toltecs raised, for the brutal and barely civilized Aztecs were of pure Turanian blood. The Semite emigrations were of 2 kinds. First, those which were controlled by the natural impulse of the race. Second, that special emigration which was effected under the direct guidance of the Manu. For, strange as it may seem, it was not from the Toltecs but from this lawless and turbulent, though vigorous and energetic, sub-race that was chosen the nucleus destined to be developed into our great fifth or Aryan race. The reason, no doubt, lay in the monastic characteristic with which the number 5 is always associated. The sub-race of that number was inevitably developing its physical brain power and intellect, although at the expense of the psychic perceptions, while that same development of intellect to infinitely higher levels is at once the glory and the destined goal of our fifth root race. Dealing first with the natural emigrations, we find that in the second map period, while still leaving powerful nations on the mother continent, the Semites had spread both west and east, west to the lands now forming the United States, and thus accounting for the Semitic type to be found in some of the Indian races, and east to the northern shores of the neighbouring continent, which combined all there then was of Europe, Africa, and Asia. The type of the ancient Egyptians, as well as of other neighbouring nations, was to some extent modified by this original Semite blood, but, with the exception of the Jews, the only representatives of comparatively unmixed race at the present day are the lighter-coloured Kabyles of the Algerian mountains. The tribes resulting from the segregation effected by the Manu for the formation of the new root race eventually found their way to the southern shores of the Central Asia Sea, and there the first great Aryan kingdom was established. When the transaction dealing with the origin of a root race comes to be written, it will be seen that many of the peoples we are accustomed to call Semitic are really Aryan in blood. The world will be enlightened as to what constitutes the claim of the Hebrews to be considered a chosen people. Shortly it may be stated that they constitute an abnormal and unnatural link between the fourth and fifth root races. The Akkadians, though eventually becoming supreme rulers on the mother continents of Atlantis, owed their birthplace, as we have seen, in the second map period, to the neighbouring continent, that part occupied by the basin of the Mediterranean about the present island of Sardinia being their special home. From this centre they spread eastwards, occupying what eventually became the shores of the Levant, and reaching as far as Persia and Arabia. As we have seen, they also helped to people Egypt. The early Etruscans, the Phoenicians, including the Carthaginians and the Shumero-Akkads, were branches of this race, while the Basques of today have probably more of the Akkadian than of any other blood which flows in their veins. A reference to the early inhabitants of our own island may appropriately be made here, for it was in the early Akkadian days, about 100,000 years ago, that the colony of initiates who founded Stonehenge landed on these shores. These shores being, of course, the shores of the Scandinavian part of the continent of Europe, as shown in map number 3. The initiated priests and their followers, appear to have belonged to a very early strain of the Akkadian race. They were taller, fairer, and longer-headed than the aborigines of the country, who were a very mixed race, but mostly degenerate remnants of their Moa house. As readers of the transaction of the London Lodge on the Pyramids and Stonehenge will know, the rude simplicity of Stonehenge was intended as a protest against the extravagant ornament and over-decoration of the existing temples in Atlantis, where the debased worship of their own images was being carried on by the inhabitants. The Mongolians, as we have seen, never had any touch with the mother continent. Born on the wide plains of Tartary, their emigrations for long found ample scope within those regions, but more than once tribes of Mongol descent have overflowed from northern Asia to America across Bering Straits, and the last of such emigrations, that of the Khitans some 1300 years ago, has left traces which some Western savants have been able to follow. The presence of Mongolian blood in some tribes of North American Indians have also been recognized by various writers on ethnology. The Hungarians and Malays are both known to be offshoots of this race, ennobled in the one case by a strain of Aryan blood, degraded in the other by mixture with the effete Lemurians. But the interesting fact about the Mongolians is that its last family race is still in full force. It has not in fact yet reached its zenith, and the Japanese nation has still got history to give to the world. Arts and Sciences. It must primarily be recognized that our own Aryan race has naturally achieved far greater results in almost every direction than did the Atlanteans, but even where they failed to reach our level, the records of what they accomplished are of interest as representing the high water mark which their tide of civilization reached. On the other hand, the character of the scientific achievements in which they did outstrip us are of so dazzling a nature that bewilderment at such unequal development is apt to be the feeling left. The arts and sciences as practised by the first two races were, of course, crude in the extreme, but we do not propose to follow the progress achieved by each sub-race separately. The history of the Atlantean, as of the Aryan race, was interspersed with periods of progress and of decay. Eras of culture were followed by times of lawlessness, during which all artistic and scientific development was lost, these again being succeeded by civilizations reaching to still higher levels. It must naturally be with the periods of culture that the following remarks will deal, chief among which stands out the great Toltec era. Architecture and sculpture, painting and music were all practised in Atlantis. The music even at the best of times was crude, and the instruments of the most primitive type. All the Atlantean races were fond of colour, and brilliant hues decorated both the insides and the outsides of their houses, but painting as a fine art was never well established, though in the later days some kind of drawing and painting was taught in the schools. Sculpture, on the other hand, which was also taught in the schools, was widely practised and reached great excellence. As we shall see later on under the head of religion, it became customary for every man who could afford it to place in one of the temples an image of himself. These were sometimes carved in wood or in hard black stone like basalt, but among the wealthy it became the fashion to have their statues cast in one of the precious metals, orichalcum, gold, or silver. A very fair resemblance of the individual usually resulted, while in some cases a striking likeness was achieved. Architecture, however, was naturally the most widely practised of the arts. Their buildings were massive structures of gigantic proportions. The dwelling houses in the cities were not, as ours are, closely crowded together in streets. Like their country houses, some stood in their own garden grounds, others were separated by plots of common land, but all were isolated structures. In the case of houses of any importance, 4 blocks of building surrounded a central courtyard, in the centre of which generally stood one of the fountains, whose number in the City of Golden Gates gained for it the second appellation of the City of Waters. There was an exhibition of goods for sale as in modern streets. All transactions of buying and selling took place privately, except at stated times, when large public fairs were held in the open spaces of the cities. But the characteristic feature of the Toltec house was a tower that rose from one of its corners or from the centre of one of the blocks. A spiral staircase built outside led to the upper stories, and a pointed dome terminated the tower. this upper portion being very commonly used as an observatory. As already stated, the houses were decorated with bright colours. Some were ornamented with carvings, others with frescoes or painted patterns. The window spaces were filled with some manufactured article, similar to, but less transparent than, glass. The interiors were not furnished with the elaborate detail of our modern dwellings, but the life was highly civilized of its kind. The temples were huge halls resembling more than anything else the gigantic piles of Egypt, but built on a still more stupendous scale. The pillars supporting the roof were generally square, seldom circular. In the days of the decadence the aisles were surrounded with innumerable chapels, in which were enshrined the statues of the more important inhabitants. These side shrines indeed were occasionally of such considerable size as to admit a whole retinue of priests, whom some specially great man might have in his service for the ceremonial worship of his image. Like the private houses, the temples too were never complete without the dome-capped towers, which of course were of corresponding size and magnificence. These were used for astronomical observations and for sun worship. The precious metals were largely used in the adornment of the temples, the interiors being often not merely inlaid but plated with gold. Gold and silver were highly valued, but as we shall see later on, when the subject of the currency is dealt with, the uses to which they were put were entirely artistic and had nothing to do with coinage, while the great quantities that were then produced by the chemists, or as we should nowadays call them alchemists, may be said to have taken them out of the category of the precious metals. This power of transmutation of metals was not universal, but it was so widely possessed that enormous quantities were made. In fact, the production of the wished-for metals may be regarded as one of the industrial enterprises of those days by which these alchemists gained their living. Gold was admired even more than silver, and was consequently produced in much greater quantity. End of section 4.